Most people think they know Van Gogh. Sunflowers, starry skies, thick paint, bright color, a tragic life compressed into a few familiar images. But if you slow down and look across several paintings, something more interesting appears. Van Gogh was not painting only what he saw. He was painting pressure. Pressure inside ordinary objects. Pressure inside a face. Pressure inside flowers, trees, fields, clouds, and even a pair of worn shoes. In this video, we are going to look at 7 Van Gogh paintings from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's open access collection. Each one is public domain. Each one gives us a different way into his work. And by the end, the question is not only why Van Gogh is famous, it is why his paintings still feel alive. Van Gogh's paintings are often described through color and emotion. That is true, but it is not enough. The deeper thing is that he makes the surface of the painting active. In many older paintings, brushwork can disappear into illusion. The paint serves the image. You look through the surface and into the scene. With Van Gogh, you often feel the opposite. You look at the scene, but you also feel the hand that made it. The stroke has direction. The color has weight. The outline has pressure. A field does not simply lie flat, it ripples. A tree does not simply stand, it pushes upward. A face does not simply pose, it carries psychological force. This is why his work is so easy to recognize. Van Gogh turned looking into movement, so the structure of this video is simple. We are not going to list paintings like a museum catalog. We are going to use each painting as a tool. One painting shows how Van Gogh treats objects. One shows portrait psychology. One shows flowers as color energy. One shows labor. One shows family. One shows growth. And one shows landscape as pure movement. Together, they build a clearer picture of how he thought with paint. Start with something humble, a pair of shoes. This painting, called *Shoes*, was made in 1888. It is oil on canvas, and at first it seems almost aggressively ordinary. There is no heroic subject, no beautiful landscape, no dramatic light. Just worn footwear sitting against a simple ground, but look at the way the shoes are painted. They are heavy, bent, dark, creased, almost tired. The laces twist like small lines of tension. The leather is not smooth, it feels worked over. The brush strokes make the shoes seem used, not displayed. This is important, because Van Gogh often found dignity in ordinary things. The shoes are not decorative. They feel connected to labor, walking, poverty, and daily life. He does not need to paint the owner. The shoes imply a body. They imply movement. They imply a life outside the frame. That is one of Van Gogh's great powers. He can make an object feel like evidence. Also notice what he refuses to do. He does not polish the shoes into a beautiful still life. He does not make them elegant. He does not separate them from use. The painting keeps their roughness. That roughness is part of the meaning. In a normal luxury image, shoes might tell you about status. Here they tell you about wear. They suggest distance walked, work done, and a person who is absent but still somehow present. This is why a small subject can feel large. Van Gogh is not saying, "Look at these shoes because they are expensive." He is saying, "Look at these shoes because ordinary life has weight." Now move from an object to a person. This portrait is *L'Arlésienne, Madame Joseph Mitchell Ginu *, painted in 1888 to 1889. The sitter was Marie Ginu, a cafe owner in Arles. Van Gogh painted her as a strong, still presence. The first thing to notice is the shape. The body is broad and stable. The face is simplified but intense. The dark dress creates a heavy form against the bright yellow background. The books on the table matter too. They do not turn this into a busy scene. They make the portrait feel more psychological. She is not merely being recorded as a likeness. She is being presented as someone with interior life. The color is bold but controlled. Yellow does not behave as a neutral wall. It presses forward. The dark figure presses back. The table cuts across the bottom of the image. Everything feels direct. Van Gogh's portraits are rarely just about appearance. They are about presence. Look again at the hands and the face. The pose is still, but it is not empty. The head rests in a way that suggests thought, fatigue, patience, or guarded attention. We should be careful not to invent a private emotion and pretend we know exactly what she felt. But we can say what the painting does visually. It slows her down. It gives her weight. It turns the sitter into a kind of monument of everyday life. That is very different from a flattering society portrait. Van Gogh is less interested in smoothness than in force. The background, the table, the dress, and the face all press toward us. The portrait feels direct because the whole surface is direct. Next, flowers. Van Gogh's Oleanders was painted in 1888. Flowers can easily become pretty decoration, but that is not what happens here. The pink blossoms sit against strong green leaves, and the whole arrangement is set on a table with books. The books are important because they connect beauty with thought. This is not simply a vase of flowers. It is a still life where color, reading, and private attention all sit together. Look at the contrast. The petals are soft, but the outlines are firm. The leaves are lively, but the composition is controlled. The table's surface is flat, but the color makes it vibrate. Van Gogh does not paint flowers as fragile little things. He paints them as bursts of energy. The painting is small in subject, but not small in feeling. That is another pattern in his work. Ordinary motifs become charged because color is never passive. There is also a useful contrast with the shoes. The shoes are dark, heavy, and worn. The oleanders are bright, open, and decorative at first glance. But both paintings use ordinary things to create a mood. In the shoes, the mood comes from weight. In Oleanders it comes from color tension. The pinks do not simply sit there. They push against the greens. The books add another layer. This is a still life about pleasure, but also attention. Flowers fade. Books remain. Color blooms for a moment. Reading stretches across time. Van Gogh places these things together and lets the viewer feel the contrast. Now the scene opens outdoors. In Women Picking Olives painted in 1889, figures work among olive trees. The subject is labor, but the painting is not built like a documentary record. The trees twist. The ground rises and curves. The figures bend into the rhythm of the landscape. Nobody dominates the scene. The people and the trees are connected by movement. This is one reason Van Gogh's landscapes can feel almost alive. The human world and the natural world are not separate systems. The workers bend. The branches bend. The ground itself seems to bend. The color is quieter than in some of his more explosive works, but the energy is still there. This painting also shows how Van Gogh could turn work into rhythm. The figures are not posed for drama. They are absorbed into repeated action. Picking, bending, reaching, gathering. The painting becomes a pattern of human effort inside nature. Look at how different this is from a heroic labor scene. The workers are not isolated as grand figures. They are folded into the orchard. Their bodies echo the trees. Their movement echoes the branches. The whole image suggests work as repetition rather than spectacle. That is important. Van Gogh often cared about people who worked with their hands, but he did not always make them heroic in the obvious sense. Here, dignity comes from rhythm. The scene says, this is what labor feels like when it repeats through a day, through a season, through a life. And because the trees themselves twist and strain, the natural world seems to share that effort. The next painting is different because it is based on another artist. Van Gogh made first steps after Millet in 1890, adapting a composition by Jean-François Millet. Millet was important to Van Gogh because he treated rural life with seriousness and dignity. Here, the subject is a child taking first steps between two adults. It is a simple family scene, but Van Gogh gives it warmth through color and movement. The adult figures lean toward the child. The little body reaches forward. The garden around them is bright and active. This is not a cold academic copy. It is Van Gogh translating Millet into his own language. The strokes are more animated. The colors are stronger. The scene feels tender, but also unstable in a beautiful way because the child is literally learning balance. That makes the painting emotionally clear. It is about support. One adult releases, another receives, and the child crosses the small space between them. Van Gogh turns that tiny distance into the whole meaning of the image. The emotional power comes from the composition. The child is small, but the whole painting is organized around that movement forward. The adults form a kind of living bridge. One side lets go. The other side opens. Nothing terrible happens. Nothing grand happens, but the stakes feel real because anyone who has watched a child learn to walk knows that a few steps can feel enormous. Van Gogh's version makes the garden pulse around the family. The plants, the fence, the clothes, and the ground all share the same active surface. That is what makes it a Van Gogh translation, not just a copy after Millet. He takes a human moment and makes the world around it participate. Now look at Iris's asterisk, painted in 1890. This is a flower painting, but it feels very different from Oleanders asterisk. Here, the flowers fill the field of vision. The image is dense, almost all over. The blue-purple irises push upward from the green leaves. The petals curve, twist, and open like living shapes. One of the most striking things is how little empty space there is. The painting does not invite you to stand far away and admire a centered bouquet. It pulls you into the growth itself. The leaves form sharp rhythms. The blossoms create bursts of color. The whole image feels close to the ground. Van Gogh is not painting flowers as symbols only. He is painting growth as structure. The repetition is important. Each flower is related to the next, but not identical. That tension between pattern and individuality gives the painting its life. This is where close looking really matters. If you only glance at the painting, you see flowers. But if you stay with it, the flowers become a crowd of different gestures. Some petals open outward, some curl inward, some flowers stand tall, others lean. The leaves cut diagonally through the space like green blades. The painting keeps switching between order and wildness. That is part of why it works so well on video. You can begin with the full image, then move into details, and each detail still has its own small drama. The painting is not one decorative pattern repeated mechanically. It is a living system made from variations. Finally, the landscape that brings many of these ideas together. Asterisk wheat field with Cypresses asterisk, painted in 1889. At first, it is a view of a field, trees, hills, and sky, but everything moves. The wheat in the foreground bends like water. The cypresses rise like dark flames. The hills roll. The clouds seem pushed by wind across the top of the canvas. This painting is a perfect example of Van Gogh making nature expressive. There is no central person, no event, no narrative action, but the painting still has drama because the brushwork turns the landscape into a system of forces. The field moves horizontally. The cypresses push vertically. The clouds roll across the sky. Yellow presses against blue. Dark green cuts into light. White clouds thicken and curl. The scene is readable from a distance, but up close it becomes a record of touch. You see how the image was made. And that is the point. Van Gogh's landscape is not passive scenery. It is emotion organized as paint. This is also why asterisk wheat field with Cypresses asterisk is a strong closing painting for this video. It contains many of the same ideas we have already seen. The ordinary dignity of the shoes becomes the ordinary dignity of a field. The force of the portrait becomes the force of the cypress trees. The color energy of the flowers becomes the yellow and blue contrast of wheat and sky. The rhythm of labor in the olive grove becomes the rhythm of wind across the landscape. And the growth of the irises becomes the growth of the entire natural world. The painting feels alive because Van Gogh has spent the whole language of his art making still things move. Across these 7 paintings, Van Gogh keeps returning to the same problem. How do you make ordinary things feel fully alive? Shoes become evidence of a life. A portrait becomes presence. Flowers become energy. Workers become rhythm. A child taking first steps becomes a whole drama of care. Irises become growth. And a wheat field becomes weather, motion, and feeling. That is why Van Gogh still matters. He did not only paint subjects. He painted intensity. And once you see that, even a pair of old shoes can start to move.